Hello and welcome to the Texas Revolution lesson. This lesson is part of the Manifest Destiny unit. What we're looking at here is how settlers come into Texas and have conflict with the Mexican government that is in control of Texas, and how that conflict ultimately leads to Texas being one step closer to being part of the United States, and the United States and Mexico being one step closer to war. So if we look here at this map, we are going to be focused today on this orangish yellow color here. It is going to be the area that is going to be in conflict between the Texans, the Americans, and the Mexican government. Texas is this area in the yellow. Originally had been called Tejas by the Spanish government. And the reason that we're talking about Spain and the Spanish government right now is because the area that is in this darker orange red color, this Texas part right here that we just talked about, and all the way down through Mexico into Central America, used to be controlled by the Spanish. And Spanish control led all the way up to California, all the way down into Central America. This land had very few settlers, this Tejas area, this Texas territory. In fact, only 5,000 Tejanos, or people of Spanish heritage, who thought of Texas as their home, lived there. So a very large area of land with thousands of acres to cover, with very few actual Spanish citizens living there. This leads to a few problems. The less people that are there, the more likely it is to have Native American attacks or other countries try to take over your land. So you really want more people to move into the area that you are trying to control. So in 1820, to try to defend this land against Native Americans and other countries, the Spanish government offered huge tracts of land to people. They tried to get people to come into Texas to try to start their colonies and try to start kind of growing and kind of jumpstart the growth of this area. They tried this for a while, but no Spanish people want to move into Tejas or into Texas to try to start a colony. So instead, they start turning to Americans to try to get them to come into Texas to start their own colonies. And the first person that agrees to do this, and they agree to let do this, is Moses Austin. So the Spanish government, which controls Texas at this time, gives Moses Austin a contract that says he can set up a colony in Texas. In 1821, however, Moses Austin dies, and the contract that he has with the Spanish government kind of moves to his son, and his son's name is Stephen F. Austin. So Stephen F. Austin takes over that colony, or that right to the colony, but that's complicated because in between 1821, when Moses Austin dies, and later in 1821, when Stephen F. Austin wants to set up his colony, the claim to that land becomes worthless because Spain no longer controls it. Because what has happened is, just like the Americans broke away from the British, the Mexican government breaks away from Spain. So there's Spanish control, but the Mexican citizens are unhappy with that control. So they rise up in revolution against the Spanish government, and they win and start their own independent nation of Mexico. So now that area of Texas is controlled by Mexico. So the area of land that Stephen F. Austin wants to set up a colony in is no longer part of Spain, but in control by Mexico. So Stephen F. Austin, who is this gentleman down here in this picture with a very long gun and very bad hair, Austin goes to Mexico City to see if the Mexicans would still let him set up a colony. The Mexicans do eventually say yes to this, but only if the new settlers that came into Texas would become Mexican citizens, so that means follow Mexican government laws, and also become Roman Catholic and practice that religion. Austin convinces 300 families to come to Texas between 1821 and 1825. These families are known as the Old 300. Austin demanded proof that the settlers were hardworking and did not drink, so he's trying to run a tight ship here. By 1830, the population swelled to more than 25,000 Americans, and that number puts the American population outnumbering the Tejanos population 6-1. So now the American settlers are in the vast majority in Texas over the original inhabitants from the Spanish government, the Tejanos. So this is all going to kind of raise tensions up a notch. So we start with Americans that are living there hate the Mexican laws. One of the biggest issues is that they have is that in the 1830s, the Mexican government outlaws slavery, and Texas slave owners are very unhappy with that. The Tejanos living in Texas hated the Americans hated the Tejanos, and the Tejanos and Americans both hated the Mexican laws and government. So you have three groups of people that all basically hate each other, and the Tejanos and Americans have a common enemy in the Mexican government. The Mexican government is worried more so that either of those groups would start a revolution themselves and start a revolt and rise up and try to break away from Mexico and start their own independent nation in Texas. So the Mexican government sent troops to Texas and closed Texas to American immigration. So no more Americans can come in, which upset the Americans living there. And there are a lot more Mexican troops there, which also upsets everybody living in Texas. So now we're just turning it up another notch. Both Americans and Tejanos talked about breaking away from Mexico, and to avoid war, Stephen F. Austin goes to Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, and basically wants to sit down and talk to the government and say, what if Mexico just is able to be a self-governing state within Mexico? So we'd still pay taxes to you, we'd still follow your laws and rules and all of those things, but we would be a self-governing state within your country. And it's very possible that the Mexican government would have accepted that option. But what ends up happening is Stephen F. Austin has written a letter to his friends back home in Texas explaining that if the Mexican government does not accept what his proposal is, he would then support the idea of Texas leading a revolution and revolting against Mexico and breaking away. The president of Mexico at the time, President General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, we will just refer to as Santa Anna from now on, intercepts this letter and sees this talk of Stephen F. Austin supporting a revolution. And he basically gets very angry about this and refuses to allow Texas to become a self-governing state, takes Stephen F. Austin, throws him in jail for a year, and now things are again turned up a notch. Santa Anna, the Texans, the Tejanos, they're all increasingly frustrated and angry with each other. Santa Anna sends more troops into Texas, but the Texans actually fight and battle the Mexican soldiers and win a few battles. This angers Santa Anna, so he sent in even more troops. So now we're just turning it up one more notch. During March 1st and 2nd, 1836, the Texans meet at Washington on the Brazos, and they actually declare Texas to be a free and independent republic. So just like if you rewind to the Declaration of Independence and the Americans basically writing a letter to King George and saying, we are now our own country, we are a brand new nation of America, this is essentially the Texans doing the same thing to the Mexican government. They send a message and say, hey, we are now our own nation. We are no longer part of Mexico. This is our Declaration of Independence. Sam Houston, who is on the left, pictured here where he's a little bit older than during the Texas Revolution. He is placed in command of a small Texas army, and Juan Sequin, who's on the right, was a Tejanos, and he helps out the Texans by leading a small group of fighting force of Tejanos. So the Texas fighting force is very small and very outnumbered. So any battle that they get into, they really have to be smart about what they're doing, and they really have to fight very hard. One group of Texans is stationed at the Alamo and another at Fort Goliad. On February 23rd, 1836, Santa Anna begins his attack on the Alamo. And this is going to be the big turning point in this Texas Revolution. 2 nights later, the Texans are still fighting. They're trying to send a message out to their other Texans, but when the messenger finally does return, who is Sequin, he finds that everybody at the Alamo is dead, and the Alamo has been captured and defeated. The Texans defended the Alamo for 12 violent days and nights, but on the 13th day, Santa Anna, who's in charge of the Mexican forces, is basically tired of this. He orders 18,000 troops to storm the Alamo, and basically kills everybody inside the Alamo, anybody left. Only 7 Texans survive after all of the fighting is over, and those 7 Texans are even executed. In total, 183 Texans die. So this story is really going to be a rallying moment, a momentum shift for the Texans themselves, because they are going to hear this story of brutality and really go towards this idea of fighting against the Mexican government. As Santa Anna pushed on, Houston and his army are basically forced to run away eastward. But as Sam Houston and the Texans go east, they are actually doubling in size of their army, because this story of the Alamo and the terrible things that have happened to the people at the Alamo at the hands of the Mexican government, that message and that story start to spread, and more Texans are saying, hey, I want to fight against the Mexican government. I want to be a part of Sam Houston's army. In April of 1836, Houston led a surprise attack on Santa Anna near the San Jacinto River. And this is the battle where we really see that rallying cry of remember the Alamo. Like, hey, it's not only, you might say it's a battle cry. It was a legitimate battle cry. They cried it out at the Mexican government, or at the Mexican troops during battle. So it was a legitimate battle cry. Remember the Alamo. A very fierce battle, a very energized Texas army. And in 18 minutes at San Jacinto, Texans had killed more than half of the Mexican army. And Santa Anna is basically forced into surrendering and signing a peace treaty. This peace treaty leads to Texas becoming an independent nation called the Lone Star Republic. So the Texas Revolution leads to Texas winning their independence. And what you have is now 3 separate nations. You have Mexico, that is going to be modern day Mexico, all the way up through Arizona and Colorado, California, that sort of area. And then you also have the second nation here is Texas, the Lone Star Republic. And then lastly, the United States. And you have all 3 of these kind of, the tensions are so high amongst all of them. In 1836, Texas decided maybe it's not such a good idea to just be their own tiny little country, and maybe it'd be better if they joined the United States. So they asked the United States Congress to annex them, or basically allow them to join into the Union. But Americans are kind of split on this at the moment. They're worried on one hand that if Texas joins the United States, it would upset the balance between the free and slave states, and that would lead to war within the United States, that the slave states and free states would get so angry at one another and the balance of power would be upset that it would lead to war within the United States. And they're also worried that if they annex Texas, it would upset Mexico so much that it would lead to war. And with all of that in mind, Congress voted against that annexation of Texas. So essentially, what we see here is that the Texas Revolution leads to the creation of a new nation, the Lone Star Republic, that just increases tension both in the United States and with the United States and Mexico. And just because they don't annex it right away doesn't mean that these problems go away. The problem of slavery, free states, slave states, that's still there. And it's going to be a problem eventually when new states are incorporated into the United States. And the tension with Mexico, that's still going to be there because the Americans still want to push out into the West and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So this sets up our next phase here, which is a war with Mexico. And it all kind of is kicked off by this issue in Texas.